February 24th, 1945. Intramuros, Manila. The smell of smoke and death clung to the air. The once proud pearl of the Orient, the crown jewel of Asia, now lay in ruins. Buildings that had stood since the days of Spanish galleons were reduced to heaps of ash and twisted iron. Streets that once echoed with laughter and music were silent, save for the hum of flies and the distant crackle of fire. Private First Class Harold Hal Spencer of the 591st Engineer Battalion stepped carefully over shattered cobblestones, his boots crunching glass. His unit had just arrived with orders from General Douglas MacArthur himself. Rebuild, restore, revive. Hal looked around at what was left of Manila and muttered, "Where do we even start?" To his left, Filipino civilians, barefoot, emaciated, eyes hollow from weeks of terror, picked through debris in search of food or family. To his right, a line of Japanese prisoners of war sat in silence, their wrists bound loosely with rope, heads lowered. They had been captured during the liberation. Men who once fought for every inch of this city, now staring blankly at what they had destroyed. Overhead, the sun blazed mercilessly through the haze. The air shimmered with heat, dust, and disbelief. Manila was dead, or so it seemed. But the Americans had brought something the Japanese did not expect: machines. By the hundreds, US Army bulldozers, cranes, and trucks rolled off Liberty ships docked at the ruined port. Their engines rumbled through the skeleton streets, pushing aside rubble, clearing roads, and carving paths through the devastation. Filipino volunteers, students, mothers, even priests joined the soldiers, hauling bricks and broken timber. They sang while they worked, their voices faint but defiant. It wasn't just reconstruction, it was resurrection. By the first week of March, bridges that had been blasted apart by retreating Japanese troops began to reappear. The Bailey bridges, modular, steel, quick to assemble, stretched across the Pasig River like veins pumping life back into a wounded heart. From their barbed wire enclosure on the outskirts of the city, the Japanese POWs watched in stunned silence. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, a 27-year-old mechanic from Osaka, whispered to the man beside him, "They rebuild faster than we destroyed it." His comrade only nodded, too ashamed to answer. Every day, the prisoners were marched under guard past convoys of American supply trucks. They carried not just rations and ammunition, but crates of cement, steel beams, and food. Some trucks bore signs that made the Japanese soldiers stop and stare. Coca-Cola Bottling Unit, 24th Corps, one read. Inside, uniformed Americans passed out cold glass bottles to engineers and civilians alike. The hiss of carbonation, the clink of glass, and the sound of laughter echoed across a landscape of ruin. Tanaka had fought in China, Burma, and Leyte. He had seen villages burned to ash and cities flattened by bombs. But he had never seen this: an enemy who built faster than they killed. By late March, the ruins of Manila were no longer silent. The clang of hammers and the rumble of trucks replaced the gunfire that once haunted every corner. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the shattered skyline, the American engineers worked by the glow of makeshift floodlights powered by portable generators. Filipino children gathered nearby, watching in awe. Some brought coconuts and rice wrapped in banana leaves to share. Others simply smiled, hopeful for the first time in years. And from the prison camp outside the city, the Japanese soldiers watched the light spread across the night. For them, it was like watching a civilization rise from its own ashes, something they had been told was impossible. April the 2nd, 1945, Port Area, Manila. The sun blazed off the deck of the Liberty ship, SS James M. Wayne, as cranes swung into motion, unloading crates of food, steel, and machinery. The once silent docks were now alive with movement. Filipino dock workers shouting in Tagalog, American engineers directing trucks, and the rhythmic thump of cranes lowering cargo onto the shore. The harbour that had once been choked with wrecks was now clearing, ship by ship, day by day. Private First Class Hal Spencer wiped sweat from his brow and looked toward the skyline, or what was left of it. Where Spanish-era churches once stood, There were now skeletal spires. The air was thick with the smell of diesel, salt, and concrete dust. Yet amid the devastation, there was energy, a pulse. Everywhere he looked, people were working. US Army engineers in khaki overalls manned bulldozers that cut through collapsed streets. Filipino men hauled rebar and cement. Women cooked rice and soup in makeshift kitchens to feed the laborers. And on the steps of a shattered university, schoolchildren scrubbed bricks clean to reuse them for new classrooms. By early afternoon, Howe's convoy rumbled past a group of Japanese POWs under MP guard. The prisoners, dressed in patched uniforms, were sweeping debris and stacking bricks in neat piles. One of them, a young corporal from Nagoya, paused for a moment, staring as an American crane hoisted an entire steel girder into place. He whispered softly, "Hayai, totemo hayai." Fast, unbelievably fast. To these men, conditioned to believe the Americans were lazy and decadent, the sight was incomprehensible. In just weeks, Manila had gone from ruin to rebirth. Roads were being graded, hospitals reopened, and electric lights flickered again in some neighborhoods. Inside a newly established engineering headquarters at Fort Santiago, Colonel James H. Critchfield stood over a table covered in maps. "We'll have the Quezon Bridge back up in 21 days, he said flatly, tracing a finger along the Pasig River. "We're using Bailey sections from Lingayen. If they could cross the Rhine with them, we can damn sure span this river." Outside, a jeep backfired, and laughter echoed through the compound. The kind of laughter that only exists when men realize they've beaten impossible odds. By mid-April, American bulldozers were clearing what locals called the graveyard blocks, streets where entire families had been buried under collapsed buildings. The engineers worked in silence, uncovering both bones and memories. Hal never forgot the face of a Filipino boy who handed him a rusted crucifix found in the rubble and said softly, "Para sa bago," for the new one. Weeks passed. Rain began to fall again, turning dust into mud. Yet construction never stopped. US Seabees worked through tropical storms under flickering floodlights, their shadows long against ruined walls. At dawn, Japanese POWs were marched past the same scenes every day. Trucks loaded with timber, workers singing folk songs, and signs painted hastily on plywood. "Manila will rise again." For Sergeant Tanaka, each morning felt heavier. He had fought for an empire that promised eternal victory, yet here he was, defeated, starving, and watching his enemy rebuild what his army had tried to erase. One afternoon, as he and other POWs labored near a bombed hospital, a US Army nurse passed by carrying medical crates. She smiled politely at them, not mockingly, but simply human. Tanaka froze, unsure how to respond. Back home, he had been told Americans were monsters. Instead, they were handing out medicine. That night, as the tropical rain fell in sheets, the lights of Manila glowed faintly through the mist. Electric bulbs strung along rebuilt power lines, casting reflections in puddles. The city was breathing again. From the hills outside Intramuros, the Japanese prisoners watched the lights flicker on. For the first time, many of them understood what their officers never had: that America's power did not lie only in its bombs or tanks. It was in its ability to create after destroying, to build where others could only conquer. Private Hal Spencer stood on the balcony of a half-repaired government building, sipping cold coffee from a tin cup. The city stretched before him, broken, stubborn, and alive. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, its sound echoing faintly through the humid night. He smiled and said quietly, "Guess MacArthur was right. She's coming back." May 15th, 1945, Manila. The monsoon season had begun, but the city refused to rest. Sheets of rain turned the streets into rivers, yet the sounds of rebuilding never stopped. The grind of bulldozers, the clatter of steel, and the rhythmic calls of workers hauling timber. American engineers and Filipino civilians labored shoulder to shoulder beneath ponchos and palm leaf shelters, their boots sinking into the mud. Private Hal Spencer and his squad had been reassigned to assist the 1135th Engineer Combat Group in clearing the area near the Legislative Building, once the symbol of government, now a hollow shell pocked with bullet holes. As Hal guided a bulldozer through a tangle of debris, he noticed a group of civilians standing nearby, salvaging bricks under umbrellas made of tarpaulin. One of them, a young woman in a torn dress, smiled as their eyes met. She balanced a stack of bricks on her head, walking barefoot through the rain. That quiet resilience, the refusal to stop rebuilding, struck him harder than any speech could. Inside the Japanese POW camp at the edge of the city, the rain drummed steadily on tin roofs. The prisoners, now fewer in number, stood in formation awaiting their daily work assignments. Many were emaciated, their faces gaunt from hunger and malaria. But each day they marched through the mud toward construction sites, schools, hospitals, and bridges, where they labored under American supervision. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka worked alongside Filipino volunteers repairing a section of the Jones Bridge. His fingers, once used to handle wrenches for tank maintenance, were now raw from lifting stones. Yet as he worked, he could not help glancing across the river, where Filipino children played in puddles near the newly reopened Coca-Cola bottling plant. The sight was surreal, laughter returning to a city he had helped destroy. America, they build even in rain, he murmured. The Filipino man beside him, a middle-aged mason, replied in simple English, "We build because we must." That night, Tanaka sat in his barrack staring through the open door at the glow of streetlights across the Pasig. He had never imagined seeing light in Manila again. In Japan, he had been taught that defeat meant dishonor, that surrender was worse than death. But as he watched civilians rebuilding homes from shattered walls and soldiers clearing rubble for new schools, he began to question everything he had believed about strength. Meanwhile, General Douglas MacArthur toured the reconstruction zones under a canopy of umbrellas. The streets were lined with cheering civilians, waving small American and Philippine flags. Behind him, a convoy of trucks carried medical supplies, textbooks, and typewriters. Reporters snapped photographs as MacArthur addressed a crowd near the rebuilt post office building. "This city," he declared, "has been bathed in blood, but she stands again, a testament not to conquest, but to courage." The words echoed across the ruins, carried by wind and rain. By June, Manila's transformation had become undeniable. Power lines stretched from one end of the city to the other. The newly repaired Quezon Bridge gleamed under morning sunlight, its steel frame reflecting in the calm waters of the Pasig. Trolley lines rattled again, carrying workers and schoolchildren. Even the smell of fresh bread returned, drifting from the rebuilt bakeries. Japanese prisoners continued their daily marches through this rising metropolis, passing civilians who no longer looked at them with hatred, only exhaustion, perhaps even pity. Some Filipinos offered them food, others ignored them entirely. To many Japanese soldiers, that mercy was harder to bear than any punishment. One evening, Tanaka paused as his work crew returned to camp. Across the river, in the glow of sunset, he saw a Filipino family lighting candles inside a half-repaired home. The faint sound of laughter carried over the water. For the first time since the war began, he bowed his head, not to a superior, but to the city itself. In his pocket, he carried a small scrap of paper torn from a supply manifest. On it, written in clumsy English, were the words he had copied from a wall near the harbour. "Manila will rise again." By the time the US Army prepared to withdraw its engineering units later that summer, the once ruined capital had become a living city once more, scarred yet breathing. Private Hal Spencer stood atop a newly paved road near Intramuros, watching the sunset over the rebuilt skyline. Beside him, Filipino workers joked and smoked, their laughter echoing through the humid air. Trucks rolled by, carrying both soldiers and civilians, partners in a resurrection neither side would ever forget. He smiled faintly and said to no one in particular, "They couldn't bomb the soul out of this place." And somewhere nearby, behind the fences of a quiet POW camp, a Japanese sergeant stared out at the same horizon and silently agreed.